The morning started like any other. I brewed the usual pot of coffee, set the table for two, and sat down with Megan for breakfast. She had always enjoyed our quiet mornings together before the day pulled us in different directions. We spoke briefly, mostly about mundane things, her schedule for the day, updates about her new job, and her excitement over the responsibilities she had taken on. Megan had recently started as an assistant manager at a prominent city firm, a position she'd been thrilled to secure. She mentioned, again, how much this role meant to her. "It's a step up, Tom," she said, looking across the table at me. "I want you to be proud of me." I nodded and told her to focus on what mattered, wishing her success for the day. Sentimentality wasn't my strong suit, but I understood her determination. After breakfast, I walked her to the door, watched her get into the car and drive off. Everything seemed in place. My own day began in its usual rhythm. I headed to the office, where I managed procurement for a major construction company. My role kept me occupied. There was rarely time to dwell on anything outside the tasks at hand. By mid-morning, I was already knee-deep in sorting out a mishap with one of our suppliers. A missed shipment had thrown a project timeline into chaos. It was nothing I couldn't handle, but the constant back and forth over the phone left me agitated. I value precision and efficiency, and it irritated me when others failed to meet those standards. I had just settled the issue when Megan called. Her voice came through clear and steady. She told me she'd be late that evening, something about a client briefing that required her attention. "This is important, Tom. I hope you don't mind," she added. I assured her it wasn't a problem. Megan had always thrown herself wholeheartedly into her work, often taking on more than necessary to make an impression. I respected her ambition, though I sometimes thought she pushed herself too hard for the approval of others. "Do what you need to," I said simply before hanging up. I had my own matters to deal with. The rest of my day passed uneventfully, and by evening, I found myself back home. My preferred way to unwind was in the garage, working on my motorcycles. There was a calming simplicity to it, tightening bolts, tuning engines, fixing up machines that had seen better days. It required focus and kept my mind from wandering to unnecessary places. Tonight, I'd just started reassembling an old carburetor when I noticed the time. Megan wasn't home yet, but that wasn't unusual. She'd mentioned the briefing. When she finally arrived, I stepped into the hallway to greet her. The moment she walked through the door, I caught an unfamiliar scent in the air. It wasn't her usual subtle perfume, but something sharper, more pronounced, with citrus undertones. It stood out, though I didn't comment on it. Instead, I looked at her. Megan was dressed differently than she normally would be for work. She wore a fitted dress and high heels, nothing inappropriate, but certainly more formal than her usual attire. I raised an eyebrow, and she noticed. "We had to make an impression, Tom," she said, her tone casual. "First impressions matter with clients." Her explanation seemed reasonable, and I saw no point in questioning it further. Still, there was something about her demeanor that didn't sit right with me. It wasn't overt, just subtle shifts in her posture and the way she spoke. I couldn't put my finger on it, but it lingered in the back of my mind. I brushed it off for the moment. Instead, I asked her about the meeting, and she gave a brief rundown of how things had gone. We talked about weekend plans and the usual household matters, keeping the conversation light. As the evening wore on, I tried to push the earlier oddities out of my mind. I wasn't one to overthink or let my imagination run wild. But certain details had a way of sticking. That unusual scent, her attire, the slight tension in her voice, as if she were measuring her words. They were small things, inconsequential on their own, but together they formed a pattern that didn't align with the straightforward life I was used to. Later that night, after Megan had gone to bed, I went into the kitchen to grab a glass of water. On my way back to the bedroom, I noticed her bag on the chair. It wasn't like me to snoop. I respected her privacy. But something compelled me to take a closer look. As I walked past, my eye caught a temporary badge sticking out of the side pocket. It bore the logo of her company but no name. Strange, I thought. Megan had always been meticulous about her things. When she noticed me looking at it the next morning, she explained it casually. "I lost my original badge," she said. "They gave me this temporary one until I get a replacement. Nothing to worry about." Her tone was light, but the explanation felt too rehearsed, as if she'd anticipated the question. I let it go, but my mind filed the incident away. It wasn't like me to get hung up on trivial matters, and I didn't consider myself suspicious by nature. But there were too many inconsistencies piling up. They weren't enough to draw any conclusions, but they gnawed at the edges of my thoughts. I told myself to leave it alone. People lose badges, change perfumes, and dress up for work. It wasn't unusual. Yet, the more I replayed the day's events in my mind, the more I realized how much of it felt out of place. I wasn't looking for problems, but I couldn't ignore what was right in front of me. Megan's explanation had made sense on the surface, yet it didn't dispel the nagging feeling that something was off. I didn't like uncertainty. I thrived on clarity and order, and this lack of alignment bothered me more than I cared to admit. I decided to keep my observations to myself for now. There was no point in acting prematurely, not without concrete facts. Still, I couldn't shake the thought. Too many things didn't fit the usual pattern. Something about this day felt different. The next day started like any other, with me waking up earlier than Megan. I made coffee, set it on the counter, and left a cup for her before heading to work. I was a man of routine, and sticking to it helped me keep my mind focused. Today was no exception. I had a few meetings lined up with contractors, and the bulk of my day was scheduled around resolving supply chain issues. I immersed myself in work as soon as I arrived at the office, preferring to tackle the day's tasks without unnecessary distractions. By mid-morning, the day was running smoothly. The meetings went as expected, with the usual back and forth over pricing and deadlines. My job demanded a clear head and precise decision-making, which suited my nature. I appreciated structure and control in all aspects of life, including my career. Still, as much as I stayed busy, my thoughts occasionally drifted to the previous evening. Megan's unusual attire, the unfamiliar scent she carried, and her polished explanation. It wasn't overly concerning, but it lingered in the back of my mind like a puzzle missing a piece. During lunch, I decided to call Megan. It was a brief conversation, as most of ours were during the workday. She sounded upbeat and mentioned that her day was packed with preparations for a new project. "We're meeting with investors today. It's going to be interesting," she said, her voice filled with enthusiasm. I wished her luck, keeping the tone of our call neutral and supportive, before ending the conversation. There was no reason to suspect anything outright, but something in her tone made me take note. Subtle, almost imperceptible shifts that I couldn't yet place. After wrapping up my work for the day, I headed home, looking forward to unwinding with a drink. When I arrived, Megan was already there, busy in the kitchen preparing dinner. The atmosphere felt normal, at least on the surface. She greeted me with her usual smile, and we exchanged a few words about our days. I sat at the table, letting the routine comfort me. But as I reached for a napkin, something on the table caught my attention, a receipt from a high-end restaurant. It wasn't a place we frequented together, nor was it somewhere Megan usually mentioned going. I picked up the receipt and examined it briefly. "Did you go to this restaurant today?" I asked casually, keeping my tone neutral. I wasn't looking to provoke anything, just curious about the out-of-place detail. Megan didn't hesitate. "Yes, we had lunch there with the team," she said, glancing over her shoulder while stirring a pot. It was part of the project discussion. The company covered it. Her explanation was straightforward and made sense, but one detail stood out. The receipt was for only 2 meals, not the kind of bill one would expect for a group. I didn't press the issue, though. It wasn't worth raising a flag over something that could easily have an innocent explanation. After dinner, Megan went about her evening as usual, heading to the shower while I stayed in the living room catching up on emails. At some point, I heard her phone vibrate on the bedside table. I wasn't the kind of man to pry into her personal things, but the sound drew my eyes to the screen. The message previewed briefly before disappearing. "See you tomorrow. It was wonderful." The sender wasn't saved in her contacts, just a number I didn't recognize. When Megan returned from the shower, she picked up the phone and smiled faintly as she read the message. "Work never lets me go, even at home," she said lightly, as if to dismiss any potential curiosity. I nodded without saying much. Her comment didn't sit right with me. It felt like a preemptive attempt to steer the narrative, though I kept my thoughts to myself. I wasn't the type to act rashly or jump to conclusions without evidence, but my instincts, finely tuned after years of dealing with complex work negotiations, told me there was more to this situation. Later that night, once Megan had gone to bed, I sat in my office with the faint glow of my laptop screen illuminating the room. I took a moment to write down the number from the message and decided to investigate. A quick search revealed the number was registered to someone working at Megan's company. The connection wasn't concrete, but it was enough to confirm that this wasn't some random miscommunication. It added another piece to the mental puzzle I was slowly piecing together. The next morning, Megan mentioned she had a meeting with clients after work and might be late again. I didn't react much, simply nodding and telling her to let me know if she needed anything. But this time, I had a plan. Unbeknownst to her, I'd installed a GPS tracker on her car some time ago, not out of paranoia, but as a practical measure after an attempted theft in our neighborhood months earlier. That evening, I decided to use it. True to her word, Megan drove to her office after work, and I kept an eye on her location while finishing up my own tasks. After about an hour, the tracker showed her car leaving the office and heading to a different part of town. The destination was a district known for its upscale restaurants and boutique stores, not exactly the kind of place one would expect for a routine work meeting. I debated whether to confront her immediately, but chose instead to observe for now. Acting prematurely wouldn't serve any purpose, not without concrete evidence. When she returned home later that night, Megan seemed upbeat. "We closed the deal," she announced with a satisfied smile, as though presenting an explanation before I could even ask. Her tone was confident, and she appeared genuinely pleased with the day's outcome. I acknowledged her success and moved the conversation to lighter topics, choosing not to mention what I'd observed earlier. Confronting her now, without more information, wouldn't help. Still, I couldn't ignore the feeling that something wasn't adding up. As the evening wound down, I noticed her bag sitting on the kitchen counter. Normally, I wouldn't have paid it any attention, but tonight, curiosity got the better of me. Glancing inside, I saw another receipt from the same restaurant I'd noticed the night before. This one was also for 2 meals and dated that evening. The coincidence was too significant to ignore. "How was the meeting?" I asked casually, testing her response. Megan didn't hesitate. "It was great. Dinner with the client went well. We sealed the deal," she replied confidently, her expression giving no indication of unease. Her explanation was flawless on the surface, but by now, I'd begun to notice a pattern. Her stories were consistent, but almost too polished, too rehearsed. I didn't press further. There was no need to, not yet. But as I sat in the quiet of my office later that night, I couldn't shake the growing certainty that Megan wasn't being entirely honest. The pieces were starting to come together, And while I couldn't yet see the full picture, one thing was clear: this wasn't just about work. Something deeper was at play, and I intended to find out what it was. Breakfast that morning was quieter than usual. Megan sat across from me, sipping her coffee, her usual cheerful chatter filling the room as she talked about her upcoming day. She mentioned an important client meeting and added that she might be late again. I nodded and responded in monosyllables, my mind elsewhere. While she went about her morning routine, I finalized my plan. I couldn't sit idly anymore, watching her weave explanations around events that didn't add up. It was time to act. After breakfast, Megan left for work, her car pulling out of the driveway as I stood by the window, watching. I stayed home, using the excuse of needing to work on something in the garage. The moment her car turned the corner, I opened the GPS tracking app on my phone, the one linked to the tracker I'd discreetly installed on her car days earlier. Her movements flashed on the screen. True to her word, she drove straight to her office. But I knew that was just the beginning. The real interest would come later in the day. As the hours passed, I busied myself with small tasks to keep my hands occupied, but my mind stayed sharp, waiting for any change in her routine. By late morning, I noticed her car moving again. The tracker showed her leaving the office and heading toward downtown. Her car eventually stopped near a high-end restaurant. I recognized the name from the receipts I'd seen earlier. I considered driving there myself, but decided against it. This wasn't the moment to make a move. I needed more than a confrontation based on assumptions. I needed proof. While waiting, I turned my attention to her phone. Using my access to her cloud account, I began recovering some of her deleted messages. Most of the conversations were ordinary, nothing out of the ordinary for work-related chats. But one thread stood out, a series of messages from someone named John. The exchanges were subtle, but hinted at a relationship that went beyond professional boundaries. Mentions of lunches, compliments on her appearance, and one message in particular caught my eye. "Can't wait for tonight. I hope you wear that dress I love." My jaw tightened as I read the words, but I didn't let anger cloud my thoughts. I wasn't a man prone to losing control. Every step I took needed to be calculated. When Megan returned home later that evening, she was dressed impeccably, as usual, flawless makeup, carefully chosen jewelry, and her ever-present smile. But something caught my eye as she stepped out of her shoes in the entryway. The thin layer of dust on her heels. It wasn't the kind of dust one would pick up in an office environment. I noted it silently, asking her how her day went as I observed her closely. Megan gave the same polished responses: long hours in the office, a working dinner with colleagues. Her delivery was smooth, confident, and practiced. I didn't interrupt, choosing instead to listen and observe. Later that night, after Megan had gone to shower, I decided to revisit her bag. This time, I searched for anything that might provide further clarity. In the side pocket, I found what I was looking for: an elegant card, the kind reserved for intimate gestures. The handwriting was neat, deliberate, and the message brief but telling. "Looking forward to our next meeting. You are incredible, Megan." There was no signature, but the card was fresh, as if recently placed there. I took a photo of it, carefully returned it to its spot, and stepped away. My suspicions were no longer vague. They were sharpening into certainty. The next day, I took my investigation further. After Megan left for work, I followed her. Keeping a safe distance, I tracked her movements via the GPS, confirming her arrival at the office first thing in the morning. For a few hours, she stayed put, attending to whatever tasks filled her schedule. But then, just before lunch, her car left the office again. I followed at a distance, weaving through traffic to avoid drawing attention. Soon, I found myself parked near the same upscale restaurant from the day before. Through the windshield of my car, I saw Megan enter the restaurant, meeting a man I didn't recognize. From my vantage point, I observed their interaction. It didn't take much to see they were more than just colleagues. Their body language betrayed a familiarity that wasn't professional, casual touches on the arm, prolonged eye contact, and smiles that carried undertones of intimacy. I stayed in the car, watching from a distance, keeping my emotions tightly locked away. This wasn't the time for impulsive action. My instincts, honed over years of managing high-stakes business situations, told me to stay calm and collect evidence. That evening, when Megan returned home, she carried herself with the same composed demeanor. She casually mentioned that she'd had another meeting with clients, and that things were progressing well. Her confidence in her lies was remarkable, as though she genuinely believed I wouldn't question her stories. I kept my tone neutral as I nodded along, asking just enough to keep her talking. But inside, I felt the weight of the day's revelation settling heavily on my shoulders. Later that night, when Megan was asleep, I returned to her phone. This time, I found more than just messages. There were photos from the restaurant, images of her and the man I had seen earlier. They were sitting close, smiling in ways that told a story words couldn't. The timestamp on the photo confirmed it was from that afternoon. I saved the photos to my phone, knowing I was building a case that left no room for doubt. I didn't confront her that night. It wasn't the time. I needed to think carefully about my next steps. Confrontation without preparation wasn't my style. I was a man who believed in strategy, in playing the long game. Confronting Megan now would only give her the chance to cover her tracks or twist the narrative. I wanted her to feel secure, to believe that I was none the wiser while I gathered every piece of the puzzle. By now, it was no longer a matter of suspicion. The evidence was there, clear and undeniable. But this wasn't just about discovering infidelity. It felt like a game, a strategic battle where the stakes were personal, and I was determined to win. I wasn't a man who lost easily, and this wouldn't be the exception. This wasn't just about betrayal. This was about control, and I intended to regain it. I woke up on the fourth day with a clear purpose. I had spent the last few days carefully piecing together every inconsistency, every lie, and every detail Megan thought she had concealed. By now, I had enough evidence to confront her outright, but I wasn't ready to act yet. Confrontation wasn't my goal, not yet. I needed to do this right. This wasn't just about catching her in the act. It was about ensuring there was no way for her to twist the truth or escape accountability. It was about principle now. At breakfast, Megan looked as composed as ever. Her appearance was flawless, from her carefully styled hair to her polished makeup. But one thing stood out to me, her choice of outfit. It was brighter, flashier than her usual work attire, and I knew her company didn't require that level of formality for day-to-day office work. Curious but keeping my tone casual, I asked her why she was dressed that way. She smiled, brushing it off with an explanation about a project casting where she needed to make a good impression. It was convincing, as her lies always were, but I knew better now. It was just another part of her performance. Once Megan left for work, I returned to the GPS tracking app on my phone. As expected, her car headed straight to her office. I wasn't surprised. She was meticulous in keeping up appearances. But I knew the day wouldn't stay this predictable for long. I settled into my routine, keeping one eye on her movements through the app, while using the other hours to dig deeper into her life. By mid-morning, her car left the office and began moving toward downtown. This time, instead of simply watching, I decided to expand my reach. Through a contact in IT security, I gained access to her work emails. It wasn't something I did lightly, but I was past the point of hesitation. Scanning through her inbox, I found what I was looking for. On the surface, her messages seemed professional, but as I delved deeper, patterns emerged. Megan was engaging in flirtatious exchanges with multiple colleagues, each one tailored to its recipient. She spoke to one man about his creativity, complimenting his vision for projects. To another, she expressed admiration for his unwavering support and special understanding. These weren't standard work relationships. They were calculated, intimate, and manipulative. The most damning message was from the night before. It was sent to the same John I'd identified earlier. "Don't forget about tonight. You know how much I love when you stand out," it read. The message was clear, and it aligned perfectly with her actions. I took screenshots of everything, saving them to a secure folder on my phone. The pieces were beginning to fall into place. My investigation didn't stop there. I went through our joint bank account, looking for anything out of the ordinary. Sure enough, I found a recent transaction for an expensive dress from a boutique she'd never mentioned visiting. The dress was extravagant, far more so than anything she usually wore to work. It wasn't hard to connect the dots. This wasn't for business meetings or casual dinners with colleagues. This was for someone or something special. The dress was another brick in the wall of evidence I was building against her. By late afternoon, Megan's GPS tracker showed her heading back toward the same upscale district she'd visited earlier in the week. I knew her routine well enough now to anticipate what was coming. I decided to follow her this time, keeping a safe distance to avoid detection. Her car eventually stopped outside a private, high-end club. I parked nearby, close enough to watch without drawing attention. Moments later, I saw her step out of her car wearing the new dress. She looked immaculate, exuding confidence with every step. This was no ordinary outing. I watched as she walked toward the club's entrance. Before she reached the door, another car pulled up, and out stepped John, the same man I'd seen in the photos and traced through her messages. They exchanged a brief hug, casual but intimate enough to confirm everything I had suspected. Together, they disappeared inside the club, leaving me sitting in my car, my thoughts churning but my emotions firmly in check. Rather than storming into the club, I decided to gather more information. Acting impulsively wouldn't serve my purpose. I approached a staff member near the back entrance and, with a bit of cash, persuaded him to share details about the event. It was a private party for select employees of Megan's company. According to him, these gatherings were more personal than professional, with attendees often blurring the lines between business and pleasure. The description only reinforced what I already knew. Returning to my car, I stayed parked outside the club for a while longer, watching and waiting. My mind worked through every detail I'd uncovered over the past few days. The emails, the receipts, the photos, the GPS logs, it all formed an undeniable picture. Megan wasn't just being unfaithful. She was crafting an elaborate web of lies, carefully managing appearances while keeping me in the dark. But she'd underestimated me. That night, when Megan returned home, her demeanor was as polished as ever. She looked tired but pleased, the kind of satisfaction that came from a day of getting exactly what she wanted. She offered her usual stories about late meetings and successful negotiations, her voice steady and confident. I listened, nodding at the right moments, pretending to buy into her narrative. She had no idea what I knew, no clue that I'd unraveled the entire facade. As I sat alone later that night, reviewing the evidence I'd gathered, I felt an unexpected calm. I wasn't angry anymore, not in the way one might expect. What I felt was a cold, calculated determination. This wasn't just about her betrayal. It had become something bigger. It was a challenge, a battle of wits and strategy. I had all the pieces I needed to expose her, but the timing had to be perfect. I wanted her to believe she was safe, that her lives were intact, even as I prepared to dismantle everything she'd built. Megan had no idea that her world was on the verge of collapse. For now, She still wore the mask of confidence and control, but I knew better. The ground beneath her was crumbling, and when the moment came, I'd be there to ensure she felt every consequence of her actions. This wasn't just about justice, it was about winning. And I had every intention of coming out on top. Megan still believed she held all the cards, but the reality was far different. Her world was about to fall apart, and she didn't even see it coming. That morning, I woke with a sense of clarity. The days of doubt and observation were behind me. Every action Megan had taken, every lie she had told, had been meticulously catalogued. I no longer needed confirmation of her betrayal. Now, I was focused on the execution of my plan, a precise, unrelenting campaign to dismantle the facade she had so carefully constructed. Megan's demeanor at breakfast was as casual as ever. She mentioned a private event she was attending later in the evening, making sure to highlight its importance for her career. Her voice was steady, her smile effortless. She carried herself with the same confidence that had fooled me for so long. I nodded along, giving her no indication that I knew the truth. "Of course you should go," I said. "You deserve some time to unwind." My tone was neutral, even supportive. Inside, I was already planning my next move. As soon as she left, I grabbed my keys and drove straight to my lawyer's office. The time had come to formalize the consequences of her actions. Sitting across from my attorney, I laid out everything I had: photos, messages, receipts, GPS logs. Each piece of evidence was irrefutable, painting a clear picture of Megan's infidelity and her deceit. My lawyer, though visibly surprised by the thoroughness of my documentation, wasted no time drafting the necessary divorce papers. But I wasn't stopping there. I asked him about the legal avenues available to target her professionally. Could her behavior be reported to her company? Was there a way to expose her actions to her clients without crossing any legal lines? My lawyer provided options, and I noted each one carefully. After leaving the lawyer's office, I returned home to prepare for the evening. Everything was falling into place, but I knew I had to be methodical. Megan's betrayal wasn't just personal, it was calculated, and my response needed to be just as deliberate. Before I could move forward, I needed to ensure I had full control of the situation. As I entered the house, I immediately noticed something was off. Megan's car was in the driveway, even though she wasn't supposed to be home yet. Stepping inside, I found her sprawled on the couch. She was visibly intoxicated, her hair disheveled, her makeup smeared. At first, I thought she had simply returned early, but then I noticed the details. Her dress was wrinkled, her shoes discarded haphazardly near the door. And then I saw the writing. It started on her back, crude markings in bold, black marker. My eyes followed the lines down her arms, across her legs, and over her shoulders. The words were vulgar, taunting, and humiliating. Some were names, others were explicit comments, and one phrase stood out among the chaos: 14-inch hole. My stomach tightened as I read it. It was like a public declaration of her degradation. Beneath one of the markings was an address, accompanied by the words, "If you want to know what your wife did tonight, come here." For a moment, I stood frozen, trying to process what I was seeing. Megan was unconscious, completely unaware of the state she was in. I resisted the urge to wake her, knowing it would serve no purpose. Instead, I grabbed my phone and began taking photos of everything: the writing, the address, even her face as she lay there, oblivious. These weren't just humiliating marks. They were evidence, proof of the depths to which she had sunk. I debated whether to go to the address immediately. My first instinct was to confront whoever was responsible, to demand answers. But I stopped myself. Acting out of anger would accomplish nothing. I needed to think clearly, to remain in control. Instead, I made a mental note of the address and returned to the task at hand. The next step was to compile the rest of the evidence. I uploaded the photos of Megan's markings, adding them to the growing collection of files I had already assembled. Then I drafted an anonymous email to her company's HR department, attaching the most damning evidence. My message was clear. Megan's actions weren't just unethical, they were a liability. I knew this alone would be enough to put her position at risk, but I wasn't stopping there. Later that evening, after Megan had stirred briefly before collapsing into bed, I followed the address written on her body. The location led me to a small house in an upscale neighborhood. From the outside, it looked unassuming, but the remnants of the night's activities were everywhere. Empty bottles littered the lawn, and faint music still played from inside. I parked a few houses down and approached cautiously, ensuring I wasn't seen. Once inside, the scene was exactly what I expected. The house was trashed, with discarded clothing and half-empty glasses scattered throughout the rooms. But what caught my attention were the Polaroid photos left on a table near the door. Each one captured Megan in compromising positions with multiple people. The images were explicit, leaving no doubt about what had happened. I took the photos, carefully placing them in my jacket pocket, and snapped additional pictures of the house for good measure. When I returned home, Megan was still asleep. I sat in the kitchen, reviewing the material I had gathered. The evidence was damning, not just for Megan, but for everyone involved. Their arrogance, their carelessness, it had all played into my hands. I had everything I needed to dismantle their lives piece by piece, starting with Megan. The next morning, she woke up groggy but composed herself quickly, pretending nothing was out of the ordinary. She poured herself a cup of coffee and sat across from me, her expression neutral. She didn't mention the events of the previous night, nor did she seem aware of the photos I had taken or the plans I was setting in motion. I said nothing, simply watching her as she sipped her coffee, the weight of her lies hanging heavily in the air. As I studied her, I couldn't help but think about how far she had fallen. The woman I once admired, once trusted, had become a stranger, somewhat unrecognizable. But I didn't feel anger anymore. What I felt was a cold, calculated sense of purpose. Her downfall was no longer a matter of if, but when. And tomorrow, when my carefully crafted plans began to unfold, she would finally understand the full extent of what she had done. I woke up early, as always, but this morning felt different. Everything was prepared, divorce papers signed, evidence compiled, and my plan to dismantle Megan's life and the lives of those complicit in her betrayal was ready to be set in motion. Her downfall wasn't just personal. It had become a matter of principle, a necessary reckoning. By morning, the consequences of my actions had already begun to unfold. The anonymous evidence I sent to her company's HR department had created chaos. Her intimate exchanges with colleagues, blatant misuse of corporate resources, and behavior unbecoming of her position were now public knowledge. The company's leadership acted swiftly, launching an investigation that culminated in her immediate dismissal. Megan's carefully curated reputation crumbled within hours. She returned home around midday, visibly shaken, anger and humiliation written across her face. She tossed her bag to the floor but froze when she saw me holding the divorce papers. I handed them to her without a word, my expression calm and unyielding. "Sign them," I said firmly. "You knew this was coming. Pack your things. You no longer have a place here." Her protests were immediate, pleading for another chance, but I remained silent, pointing to the boxes of her belongings I had already prepared. Megan tried to justify her actions, but I cut her off. "Mistakes happen once," I said coldly. "What you did was a choice, a series of deliberate choices. And now you face the consequences." Ignoring her tears, I helped load her things into her car, unmoved by her desperate apologies. When she finally drove away, I felt no remorse. This was only the beginning. With Megan gone, I turned my attention to those who had aided her. John, the man central to this mess, was my first target. Armed with compromising evidence, messages, photos, and videos, I sent an anonymous package to his wife. Within days, his marriage disintegrated, and his life was in ruins. I didn't stop there. Using the names marked on Megan's body, I traced each man involved, collecting enough information to dismantle their lives. Careers crumbled, families fractured, and reputations were destroyed, all with the precision of a man unwilling to let injustice go unpunished. My focus sharpened on the man responsible for the party, the architect of much of her degradation. Finding his illegal side business, I anonymously tipped off authorities, providing solid evidence. Within days, he was arrested, his operation dismantled. When it was all over, I felt satisfaction, not rage, but a calm sense of closure. Returning home that evening, I poured myself a glass of whiskey and sat on the couch, gazing out the window. The house was quiet, but it didn't feel empty. It felt like freedom. Ahead lay the legalities of divorce, but for now, I savored the silence, knowing I had reclaimed my life and restored my order. The morning of the court hearing arrived, and I was fully prepared. The months of meticulous planning, collecting evidence, and securing my assets had led to this moment. Megan, always the manipulator, believed she could sway the court with her charm and excuses, but she underestimated the extent of my preparation. I was ready to ensure she left with nothing. The first blow came when my attorney presented the evidence. The dossier I had compiled was methodical and damning: messages, photos, videos, financial transactions, and even records of her inappropriate behavior at work. Megan's lawyer attempted to shift blame onto me, citing emotional neglect, but the evidence of her multiple affairs dismantled her narrative completely. Her attempt to appear as a victim crumbled under the weight of undeniable facts. Next came the financial aspect of the case. Megan expected to walk away with a significant portion of our assets, but I had planned ahead. Months before filing, I had legally transferred my primary assets, including the house and car, to my company. My savings had been redistributed to secure accounts inaccessible to her. When her lawyer demanded a division of property, my documents clearly showed that the assets were no longer personally owned. It left her with no legal claim to anything substantial. Her humiliation grew as her professional reputation was brought into question. I presented evidence of her termination, tied directly to her unethical behavior at work. Emails and witness statements highlighted her inappropriate conduct with colleagues, further eroding her credibility. The court saw her actions for what they were: self-serving, reckless, and without remorse. The final blow came when the photos from the party were revealed. Megan's behavior, documented in explicit detail, shocked the courtroom. The judge deemed her actions not only immoral, but directly harmful to the marriage. This evidence became the cornerstone for the court's decision to deny her any spousal support. Her attempts to challenge these findings were dismissed outright. The court's ruling was decisive. Megan received nothing, not the house, the car, or a portion of my income. Instead, she was ordered to pay compensation for the emotional and reputational damage her actions had caused. This rare decision underscored the severity of her betrayal and the comprehensive nature of my case. Her lawyer's objections were futile, and Megan left the courtroom visibly shaken. As I exited the courtroom, she attempted to speak to me, desperation in her eyes. I stopped her with a single glance. "You've said enough. This is your life now. Live with it." My words marked the end of any connection between us. Her world was in ruins, and there was no coming back from it. Returning home, I felt a sense of finality. Justice had been served, but my work wasn't finished. I continued working with my legal team to file lawsuits against others involved in her betrayal. Each new case brought further closure, ensuring that no one escaped accountability. For every person who played a part in this, there were consequences. This was more than a personal victory. It was a statement, a demonstration that no one could disrupt my life without facing the full extent of my resolve. My world remained unshaken, and those who tried to destroy it were left broken and defeated.